Okay. Hi, my name's Denise Cooper. I'm an open source activist. I've been around about 20 years. So lots and lots of people have been coming up to me here to say that they've heard me speak before, and I apologize in advance for that. I wrote this presentation yesterday and sent it off to my new company, and they applied branding. So there'll be some branding on this that hasn't happened before, but they're lovely people, and so they deserve some branding. And I am going to talk to you from my 4.5 years of working at PayPal and looking at, and my 20 years of consulting in the open source space, looking at how you can get around some of the regulatory stuff or what some companies have done. And I'm going to describe a thing that we've been working on that might be useful. So here we go. First of all, I want to say that open source is both great and good. It is both things, right? But it's also got the problem of being kind of a dessert topping and a floor wax at the same time. So people don't know, that are just coming to it, aren't quite sure where they land in the continuum of, how to be part of it. And my experience is everything that's happening that I've heard in the last day and a half is exactly what we were worried about 18 years ago. And what's interesting is a lot of our worries have evaporated. So in the straight tech world, we used to have compliance like crazy. We used to run every single commit, external commit through some rigorous process. We used to do all that stuff because we were afraid. But all of those licenses that we were dealing with then trigger on distribution, and that isn't such a problem now. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these days, when I go into a new company, even PayPal, I expected that it was going to be exactly what was described by Goldman Sachs. Lots of process around releasing stuff into the public in a controlled way. And what I found was they were already past it. They didn't care anymore, except for the AGPL. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. All right. So we have to acknowledge that banking, fintech generally is a regulated industry, and if you think about why those regulations exist, how you became a regulated industry, it's because people's money matters, and you can't screw with people's money. That's why years ago Google tried to become a bank, or at least a payment processor, and it failed because their whole thing is around self-service and asynchronous communication, and people want to be able to call somebody about their money, and they just were never going to go there, so it failed for them. I think Apple Pay will probably work better because Apple understands customer service, or at least what the consumer wants in terms of connection. So you got to deal with regulations, and as a result of the regulations, I'm observing that most of the companies that are in the fintech space that are just entering the market are kind of taking the long way. Right? They're on a serious detour path because it seems too scary. It seems daunting. But I promise you guys are going to wrap your heads around it. Whoever figures it out first and gets the advantage of that is going to lead the way for everybody else. And actually, technically, in the past, fintech was the leader. I know how many of you guys know that Morgan Stanley was the first company to build a 1U x86-based supercomputer and kick their Sun stations out because of the existence of Linux. That was Morgan Stanley that did that. And they told us that everybody else in the financial services industry would be following suit, and y'all did, right? So it's not that foreign a concept. It's really just the contribution back that's hard. And you let us do it. You would back a company, like you'd choose Red Hat, or you'd choose SUSE, or you'd choose a version of Linux that was already contributing for you, if you know what I'm saying. You paid them money, and that supported their contributions. So you could think of yourselves as contributors already. Does anybody know what this is? That is a black duck. I'm going to be bashing black duck a couple of times in the course of this conversation. And not just black duck, it's just that the name is so iconic. Palamida. I don't know much about white source, but my problem with these companies is not that they provide a service. I think it's an interesting service to scan code and learn everything you can about what's going on in the code base. However, they sell by peddling fear. And a lot of what I've been hearing is almost a perfect reflection of their sales pitch to companies that are nervous. And I just want to tell you, in the case of this one company, I still don't know anybody that has a working implementation of it. Like, this is not the way to fix it. That there are, some of the stuff that Goldman Sachs was talking about where they were being really careful to check is a more rational procedure to me than expecting a third party to do a good job of this gargantuan task that they've set for themselves. They claim to have, enormous repositories of code that they have sucked into their system and they can compare your code against and tell you what's going on with it. But it's a pretty big ask what they're claiming they can do. And if you ever look at the report that you get back, it's not nearly as clear-cut as you think it's going to be, or as actionable as it should be for what they're claiming it does. So everybody in this room represents a company that is worried about the nightmare scenario. That's the thing where you are embarrassed in public or worse in a court because something has gone wrong. That's what everybody worries about. Interestingly enough, that fear of bad PR is exactly what we've been using all these years to get open source to be enforced, because the legal contracts haven't been through a ton of precedent law. And so the real truth is, anytime a company steps out of line in open source licensing, what brings them back in line is the fear of public reprisal. And so on the one hand, I understand why you're afraid of that, and I have worked in companies where that has happened and we've had to recover. But on the other hand, that's a really necessary part of open source. And it's important, I think, to realize how beneficial it can be. IBM has been surfing this line for 20 years. They're not the best citizen in the open source world by any stretch of the imagination. They've done some really nasty things to open source over the years, but they've also done some really good things, and they get to walk right down the line, right down the middle. And they're masters at it. So if you want to see how to play both ends up the middle, look at that, all right? Now, here's the good news. First of all, and I alluded to this earlier, with the exception of the AGPL, all open source licenses today trigger on distribution, physical distribution of code. So what that means is, if you were 20 years ago, you sold code boxed in a box with some manuals and some CDs or DVDs to, load it up. These days, of course, everything's delivered over the internet, but that's still distribution. But the truth is, most companies offer software as a service or a platform as a service, and the performance of the code happens behind their firewalls, and therefore they do not trigger the obligation to give up changes. So when I hear people say, well, we're worried about the GPL, there's no reason to be worried about the GPL anymore, because you're never going to trip it unless you actually ship code, okay? And if you do actually ship code, like even an app, and some of it is GPL, you need to be very careful that you've created a sufficient layer of abstraction between that app and the mothership of your code, so that there isn't a court case that says, well, because this app connects to this in a hard-linked way, then the implication is that the modifications to Linux need to be given away. That is a real problem potentially, but it's really easy to avoid, super easy. You just have to architect your apps to go through a layer of abstraction rather than directly into production, which you shouldn't do anyway, right? All right, so that's one piece of good news. Now, the AGPL, or a FARO GPL, it's got a few names, but the initials are always AGPL, is a license that attempted successfully to close the performance gap. So modern software is not distributed, it's performed on the internet. And because it's not explicitly called out as a trigger in most open source licenses, we never trigger those obligations anymore unless you physically give somebody code. But the FARO triggers on either distribution or performance. And so big companies like Google won't even touch stuff that's a FARO licensed. There's some really famous code that's a FARO licensed, MongoDB, which people love to use Mongo, especially quants love it. It's really, really easy to take extracts of data. You can play with them really easily. Pretty soon it's in your production stream. And they didn't even realize, because it looks like it's just another open source thing, that you can't afford to have it back there, right? Now, FARO knows this. They put it under that license to force you to come to them for a side license, because they own the copyrights. They can do this. And so they'll pay you. I mean, you can pay them for a relationship that doesn't trigger just because you're using it. And that's what every firm does. It's the first thing I do when I join a company, and I did it at PayPal. So is there any MongoDB lying around here? Yeah, we use it all the time. Go write a license, and then you're done, right? So it's a strategy that some companies have used to go ahead and put the Affero out there, knowing that it's going to drive side business. Okay. So the hard side of being in a regulated industry, again, the regulations are about protecting the consumer, usually, right? So if you get caught not adequately protecting the consumer, then you could have some trouble, as Mark Zuckerberg is finding out these days. And, you know, it takes a while sometimes, but the wheels of justice do eventually, you know, roll, right? It's not that there's nothing to be afraid of. It's just that there's less to be afraid of than it looks like when you first appraise the situation. So why do people open source stuff? Why do they, you know, contribute or especially do what Saks is doing and set up projects with code that they originated, that they invented? Why do they give away their inventions? Anybody know? Yeah.
Most of my clients, because they want other people to standardize on their technology, makes their lives easier.
Right, which is a form of market disruption. There are other things that you can do that are disruptive with open source. My friend Zahida there and I were involved in a famous disruption called Open Office that was aimed at Microsoft and the 40% of the business of their income that came from Office and the file format monopoly that they had. So you can use open source in some very specific market actionable ways. Making your life easier is definitely one of them. But you can also use it to make everybody else in the industry do things the way that you think they should be done for some reason of your own. Like you get better data about what your competitors are doing, or who knows what the reason is. But there's lots of clever things you can do, especially with first mover advantage, if you open source something really cool. Okay, has anybody got another reason? Yes, recruitment and hiring. Number one reason these days that I get asked to help people learn how to do open source is because kids that you hire expect to be able to do it. And let's face it, fintech, not the most exciting kind of engineering you can possibly do. You know, the hedge funds are exciting because you get a lot of money out of them, but fundamentally, it's not the best. You know, you'd rather be building stuff that gets sold that you can point at, tell your mom you worked on that, right? But you have to still be able to recruit and hopefully high enough quality talent. Offering the way that they want to work as an option is a really, really compelling thing. It actually works. And we know that it works. When Netflix was going down the tubes because they screwed up their pricing model, part of their remediation strategy was some very innovative open sourcing they did of things that are expensive to build. So they gave a gift to the community in the form of code, and it completely fixed both their reputation and their ability to recruit. So it's a real thing, right? Anybody got one more reason? No? The third reason is because you are so dependent on the software that you have to see that it stays healthy, right? So that's a lot of the contribution that goes into the Linux kernel is about continuing to make it useful. So for instance, Intel has for a long time had a group of a lot of engineers, more than you think, that do nothing but make sure that Linux out of the box, that kernel works well on the Intel platform and everything that means. That's why Linus Torvalds a few years ago said in a conference, if you just want your laptop to work the way a Mac works and you're going to run Linux, buy genuine Intel, right? That's what they wanted him to say that, but you know, they are very good at enabling platforms agnostically. Like, we don't care if you run Windows or Linux, but it's going to be a good experience, is kind of their idea. Okay. And what are people afraid of? Why do people not do open source? Anybody?
Giving away their secret sauce.
That's right. People are afraid that they're somehow going to get bamboozled into giving away the secret sauce, or their employees, they don't trust their employees to not do that. Now, that is a problem in some companies, but it also indicates you got some work to do on your employee base, right? When I was at Sun, we created the first ever public blog for a corporation called blogs.sun.com. When we launched it, we didn't go through legal and we did not go through HR to set it up. We had a conversation with the CEO, Jonathan Schwartz. He was not as good as Scott McNeely had been at massaging the message. So people in the press were not accurately reporting the message he was trying to convey. So he wanted a venue to put written work out that would, this is my position, and then he could point at it, right? So he was in favor of us doing this blog space. Sun was at a dark time at the time. And there are people who decided to stay at Sun, not bail, because of the blog that we created, because it was the only company in the world at that time that had given the employees a voice like that. We trusted our employees. We gave them 3 simple rules to follow, and I always forget one of them, but the important ones were, we hired you because you're smart. Don't fuck up. Here's how you could do that. Don't defame anybody. Don't give away a trade secret. And I always forget what the third one was. If you do one of those 3 things, we will at a minimum take down your blog, but we may fire you. So don't do that. And it totally worked. It totally worked. I only had to pull down 2 individual blog posts. One of them was my own. And that's another story. But you can trust your employees if you make what's going to happen super clear. Now, it's still true that most malicious work in engineering comes from employees who are disgruntled. That's still true. But again, if you can't clean that up, you've got a bigger problem than open source, right? What's another reason? Why do people not do this? Yes?
The low emotional bandwidth of 8-bit characters. I wrote an article some years ago saying that Java had peaked in the careers thing. And I didn't think it was a very interesting article. I wrote it. It created a firestorm. I was denounced at incredible length.
You insulted the Church of Java.
The site I wrote for actually took the best of the hate mail and made it into another article, which was just the hate mail, except for one segment, which they deleted. And people were comparing what I was saying to anti-Semitism.
Right.
So
tell me again what the root cause was there?
I've written there are too many Java programs.
Okay, but how does that relate to open source and why people don't do open source?
What you say is what you write is not what people read. That's the problem.
Okay, so you're on the blog story still. Great.
Yeah.
Who has another reason why people don't open source? Why people are afraid to open source? Cost? Well, they are afraid that it's going to make them less efficient. That's true. And interestingly enough, when we started open source, there was a famous article by Eric Raymond that claimed that this was cheaper. People will work for you for free. And it took us a long time at Sun to dispel that notion, because it's not true. It's more expensive to do open source. It's not more expensive to use open source. It's more expensive to contribute than to write it behind a firewall. But you get a lot of intangible benefits that offset that cost. What about brand risk? You guys know about that one? I had a slide about that earlier. That's where you screw up and everybody knows you screwed up because it's transparent, and all of a sudden the brand's in trouble. There's headlines that say, there was one at Sun, while I was at Sun, that said, Sun finds hole in precious GPL and drives Mack truck through it. You don't want that quote, right? Brand risk is the #1 reason that people don't do open source, and it's because they're pretty sure that they're going to screw it up and that it's going to be embarrassing. Right? And this has been a consistent problem the whole time. All right, so now we're going to switch to the way engineering is if you don't do enough open source. So how many of you worked in a company where there were discrete practices of software around code bases and they didn't talk to each other? Although the code might communicate, the people who wrote the front end didn't really talk to the people who wrote the back end so well. Right, exactly. So those are called silos. And they happen, and they create bottlenecks, because anytime you have excessive specialization, you also have to wait around for that specialist a lot, right? And that is anti-open source. The idea that you couldn't fix your own problems as an engineer. This is why GitHub Enterprise, people buy it now and put it up in their shops, thinking that it's magically, with a little pixie dust going to make them more efficient because everybody's going to be able to see everybody else's code. But then they do the thing. They fall into the trap. They stay in their comfort zone. Maybe they kicked ClearCase out to put in GitHub Enterprise. They're going to make GitHub Enterprise in their shop look a lot like ClearCase. They're going to put extra processes on it. They're going to limit who can see who else's code. They're going to tell themselves stories about how they're saving on licenses and things. But they're basically undermining the whole value proposition of everybody being able to see everybody else's code, right? So The bottleneck problem, I can tell you how to fix that one. This one is the problem where you have engineers that won't give up their secrets because they think it's going to keep them employed. They're not good at sharing, right? So that's Schmiegel, and he's not sharing his ring. This is another real problem, and especially in companies that think that they're innovative. So, or were at one time innovative. The famous company that does this, and it's actually a religion, is Apple. You can get fired at Apple today for telling the guy in the office next to you who's working on some other group what you're working on. Right? They are the extreme, and that's because Steve was like that. I honestly don't think that it's necessary anymore, but they're still kind of clinging to it. Steve liked the big reveal, and he liked a minimum of news to trickle before the big reveal. But you know, even 30 years ago when I worked at Apple, the way we found out what was happening in other parts of the company was we read Macweek, and there was a reporter that if you called him secretly from inside Apple and told him about a project that you were working on, if he got the same rumor from 2 vectors, he would publish it and he would send you a coffee mug, which you could then never use at work, right? So it's not a new thing. And then the third thing really is total mistrust of the employee base and wanting to create bumpers so the employee base can't get in trouble, can't hurt the brand, can't, you know, whatever, right? And in my experience, proper open source actually fixes this problem because all of a sudden there is way more scrutiny than there ever was before. But you have to set it up to be that. You have to do code mentoring and code review and, you know, practice that means that people really read each other's code, and then they start noticing things that aren't working well, and they tell you. You know, I used to work with Whitfield Diffie, who co-invented RSA encryption, the reason that we can buy stuff on the web. I asked him, is open or closed inherently more secure? Because we were hearing a lot about closed source being more secure. And he said there is no statistical basis for the claim that either is more secure. But I, Whitfield Diffie, prefer the transparent method because I have a better chance of finding the problem. Many eyes make small work, and we've seen that over and over again. You know, open source software typically patches in a matter of hours, where Microsoft was taking months to patch known vulnerabilities. So that doesn't mean that it's still not on your sysadmin to apply that patch on your version of whatever you're using, but it's an important concept that transparency is the new safe, right? And that idea that closed stuff is safe, that is like from World War II. You know, Official Secrets Act kind of stuff. But it doesn't actually work because they do tell their wives. They have, you know, right? Okay. So I'm going to tell you about inner source. The rest of this talk is going to be about inner source because it's what I've been working on for the last 4.5 years, but I think it's the panacea for some elements of this industry to get all the way there. I will, full disclosure, for most of the last 20 years, I had no interest in inner source as an open source activist because it did not yield public code immediately. But in my consulting world, I've had a lot of clients. It used to be really easy to find a client who could understand what I was talking about, implement it, get the benefits, have the virtuous circle. But these days, some people who really, really needed to get it right and wanted to get it right couldn't because of cultural impediments. So the famous one is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I worked with them on an educational program that they had already announced was going to be open source, and they hired me to help them get there. We set it up, but they did not succeed. The reason they didn't was their training at Microsoft, most of them had come from Microsoft in this group, is as ambiguity increases, you must increase micromanagement. That's how they're taught to work. And they couldn't drop it. And micromanaging your open source community is the fastest way to kill it. The fastest way. That's why the hoops that Goldman has to jump through are a little troubling, because that will eventually be too much drag on their developers, I believe. So these 3 books are books that we wrote about this phenomenon. I actually have a copy of this one because GitHub has reprinted this for you. It's available outside in the expo hall. It's really thin. This book, which I put out 4 years ago, Andy Oram is an editor at O'Reilly, and we co-wrote it, but my name didn't make it on the cover. This book is the most downloaded non-code asset on GitHub, which tells you it's really an interesting topic to a lot of companies. This is a story about one experiment that we did We've done a lot more, and this book, which came out at OSCON this year, is a case study book that's got a number of stories of big companies who have used this technique for various things, not just because they were afraid of open source. So what InnerSource does, if properly practiced, it can, there are companies that have used it to increase innovation. There are companies that have used it to get rid of engineering bottlenecks and silos, break silos down and create more cross-collaboration. It has the side effect of helping teams that are traditionally working with deep silos figure out how to cut, how to modularize, so that the code can actually be understood by other people more easily. It builds de facto documentation that you can't get any other way out of engineers. And it equates to velocity. There's increased velocity after the first interaction. So the first interaction in InnerSource is very expensive because it's a mentorship. He wants to give me code, but the code that he's giving me after reading my code is not going to work. I know it's not going to work because we tried the method that he's going to try to exploit, and it falls over, it doesn't scale. We already know that, but we never wrote it down because we're all on the same team. We don't need to. Everybody knows that. But somebody on the outside doesn't know it. So I send him back a mail, and I say, okay, sorry, we didn't document that method doesn't work this way, but why don't you try this one? We save that piece of email. We put it into an archive. And the next person who needs to get something into that code base reads the archive before they ask me for advice. That's your velocity increase. This is how open source works as well. You can learn everything you need to know by reading the email, right? Now, is it pretty? Reading a 300-piece threaded email is not so good, right? So eventually, if you've done what I suggested and retained them, you can watch which queries get hit the most and turn that into real documentation, right? But the reason that the engineer doesn't know to put that out there, first of all, it's embarrassing. They haven't cleaned it up yet. It's an obvious thing. People are coming to that conclusion, but they haven't modularized to get rid of that problem. Because they look at the code base and they see a whole being. And they think, wow, am I going to cut its head off or its legs off? Like, it's impossible to look at it and go, oh, okay, I see it needs to be cut down, until you start having a conversation with somebody else to explain it. And the first time you do that, you go, oh, man, this makes no sense. We got to fix this. So InnerSource is useful for lots of ills in the industry, but it definitely is a good rehearsal for doing open source. And in every company that I've worked with around InnerSource, eventually, after they have figured out how to collaborate internally and we started to have all the other good internal effects of InnerSource, they start proposing reasonable open source projects that are actually going to land. And that's really good to see, because then you know that it's not going to be a waste of time. I went to PayPal expecting to teach them how to do open source, and what I found was they didn't have anything worth opening in their coffers. And it wasn't that they're bad engineers. It was that they had a policy of pulling the best open source they could find, bringing it inside the company, huddling around it, making it work really well for their situation, and never looking back outside to see what was happening in the mother project that they had extracted from. So 3 years, 4 years later, they want to open source yet another version of MapReduce, and I'm like, well, there are 28 versions. Here they are. Do you benchmark favorably against any of them? It's not a good story. There's no point in wasting the company's time doing something that everybody else has done a million times. That's not good open source policy. All right. So that velocity effect really does happen the second, the third, the 20th, the 500th time somebody has to learn about that silo. And it also helps the people who own the silos break them down. In my company, both increased documentation and increased modularization had been like official edicts of the company for at least 2 years. They'd had sprints about it. And they weren't getting much out of it. And then we did InnerSource, and all of a sudden they were like, oh, yeah, okay. They could see it all. And we're not the only ones, because we started, I'll tell you in a little bit, we started a trade association so that we all hang out together, people in big companies that are trying to do InnerSource. And we're starting to work on a pattern language for InnerSource. And lo and behold, we all have the same problems. There are no new problems. It's just your company has a different, this one's bigger than this one, and in mine, this one's bigger than this one. So it's just the order that you attack them that changes. So I already talked about it being a suitable stepping stone to open source. It is a stepping stone because it teaches programmers who have never been asked to collaborate in this way before to do it. it dispels their fear that they're going to not be valued if they don't have the secrets that they hold. It helps them understand that the best gift that they can give at the end of their careers is mentoring new kids, right? That is the best thing you can do. That will make you live a lot longer in the memory of everybody that ever worked with you than the fact that you were the only one that knew how to do something. But you have to affection train people to know that that's the case. And so we produced a bunch, we, the InnerSource Commons, have been producing trainings, free trainings online through O'Reilly to train about the roles of InnerSource. And that plus the books that we've written are starting to be a set of documentation. We have a hard time describing it because unlike open source, it's not just a recipe. You have to do a deep cultural assessment, but probably you need to do one, I'm guessing. All right. We have this trade association that I alluded to earlier. It's called innersourcecommons.org. It is currently hanging off of PayPal, but they have committed to helping us stand it up as a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States. And we are open to there being chapters in other countries after we get that set up. Unlike the Open Source Initiative, we don't bless anything as open. We just are trying to educate people and share stories and share patterns and fail faster because we're all being really honest. In order to be really honest, we work under something called Chatham House rules. And what that means is you can, when you're sitting in one of our summits or a talk and you want to talk about InnerSource and what you're hearing, you can say anything you want. You can tweet anything you heard as long as you do it in such a way that it can't be tied back to an individual or the company they work for. That way people are pretty safe to actually ask the question because nobody's going to say, wow, that Goldman Sachs just asked a really stupid question. You know, we don't do that because all of us have been there, right? We're not interested in shaming people and brand assassination and all that stuff. We're trying to learn together. And it's working out pretty well. It's in its 4th year, and there are 300 people involved, more than 300, about 85 companies represented in those 300, and a third of them are fintech companies, and that's an artifact of it having been started at PayPal. But a lot of them are not fintech companies. And when we make it a nonprofit, we're going to do a big appeal to see if we can balance that a little bit better. But just so you know, all your friends are there already, or many of them are. We also throw 2 summits a year, and we're working on a 3rd in North America, in Europe, and somewhere in Southeast Asia, probably Singapore. And next year. We do InnerSource days at big open source conferences like OSCON, and they're always very well attended, and nobody ever leaves because the content is really, really interesting. And we have also got a tutorial that takes about 4 hours to talk to people who are going to be change agents in their own companies about what that's going to feel like and how to mitigate risk for their own careers and all that stuff. All of this stuff available for free. You just have to ask for a Slack account, which you can do in an automated way through innersourcecommons.org. And let's see, what is that? Oh, so it's a journey getting into open source. The stuff that you're making yourselves crazy about now will be less important to you after you've got a little more facility with using it. It's not a bad idea, some of the checks and balances that I'm hearing from banking companies, but it's a big overhead. And part of open source is just about frictionless, attempts to make work fun again. And we originally thought we were going to get rid of all the marketers and lawyers that we had to deal with, but now we've all turned into lawyers and marketers. I don't know what to say about that. All right, I am willing to ask questions or answer questions. Amanda, do we have any time? Okay, great. Anybody got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I agree with the sentiment about Goldman having too many hurdles, and ultimately it will probably fail. But could you give us your thoughts on maybe how they ought to simplify? Like what ought they take away? Because it feels like they put controls in to stop reputational damage, etc.
That's a lot of what they're doing there. I'm a little concerned about we cook the patch inside before we throw it over the wall, because that interrupts the feedback loop with the rest of the world. And as Apple found, so when Apple put the mock kernel into macOS, they set up a side community. They hired Jordan Hubbard, who was one of the most famous BSD programmers at that time, and they set up the Darwin community. And then they completely never, ever gave that community any breathing space. They would start to work on problems, and there's a lot of work to do. They'd start as a community to work on the next thing. And then Apple, meanwhile, is working behind the scenes on their own version of the next thing, which they would, trebuchet over the wall like a big cow, and it would land in the middle of the community and dishearten people, and they would leave. So that's my first concern, that they're going to break that we're all in this together feel. And they are projects that they're creating. So their job as good stewards of open source is to grow the number of people who can help them. And it sounds like there's a problem there. But I haven't looked at it deeply enough to know for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, just a follow-up to that, because the point that strikes me, and we've done some work within the sourcing projects with clients, in a way that sort of always doomed to failure because they are in source and open source. And actually, as you say, this lack of interaction outside the organisation actually means you've got to really force feed in the source projects.
You do initially, yeah.
And actually, we've seen it when you get to the point that empty source is actually a lot harder than open sourcing.
It's a lot harder.
Get that external influence and nurturing.
But it fixes some problems too.
Yeah, but open sourcing to start with. So I must have become more cynical around inner sourcing as the first step.
It is something that people do. They become cynical. Carl Fogel was one of those people. He worked for the company that originally coined the term inner source. And his take was middle management can derail you so easily. It's really hard.
The player layer is a problem.
Right. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, he's bullish on inner source again now. And the reason that he is open source has won. People want to figure out how to get a piece of that in their work lives, right? Most of these companies, I'd say maybe 90% of the engineers in the world are still working in the old-fashioned engineering salt mines, regardless of whether they've had Agile added on or some other practice added on. Fundamentally, way too much control, not enough artistry, not why they got into it in the first place in most cases, right? And it's disheartening, right? So what we're finding, at least in the projects that I know about, and again, I know about 85 companies doing this, yes, there can be some difficulties depending on cultural impedimenta, but it's generally beneficial and you can demonstrate that. What we advocate doing is start with a small controlled experiment. When I say controlled, I mean know the parameters of it within your corporation, not and then micromanage it. In fact, let it go, right? Explain how it's going to work, let it go. Read that little booklet. That's what we did with checkout. 90% of our work went through the checkout stack, 90%. And there were 25 of them, and they could never get through their actual planned work in a given sprint because of escalations from executives demanding that they deal with this person's request or that person's request. They were sick of escalation, and they really had a bunch of work they needed to get done. So they were super happy about adopting InnerSource. It made them all, the happiest employees in the world because people that needed to have inputs into their system were suddenly holding their own. But they also got a quality bump because they didn't do real code review, because most of the time in companies where demands are mostly time-based, code review goes out the window. People start rubber stamping other people's code. So they got that benefit. They figured out how to modularize based on what they were seeing. Everything that was supposed to happen that was good happened for them right up until the product owners, which we'd forgotten about, figured out that they weren't letting the escalation happen anymore, and they killed it because they like it when the bosses talk to each other. It makes them feel like they can move the company. So then we had to attack the problem of how do we keep the product owners happy. Well, we learned from that experiment. We could call that a failure because it fell over, but we learned and we worked on a role for the product owners. It's an incremental path. It's not a day one forward path. The only team I know that ever did that day one forward thing successfully was Bloomberg, but it fell over as soon as the sponsor left, right? Nevertheless, Bloomberg's engineering is better now than it was then, according to them, because they still come to the InnerSource Commons because they're trying to restart it, because they got it, that it helped with their culture. So yes, I know about your skepticism. I had that myself for 20 years, but now I think it is the only logical next thing to do. So, is that it? All right, I'll stick around in the hallway afterwards if you want to talk to me. Thank you.